Mature entrepreneurs often try to sharpen their communication by improving their explanations. Perhaps they look for better wording or more compelling frameworks and more convincing language. Now, in this video, I want to show you a totally different place to look. And I'll even draw it out for you as we go, because this one shift can really change how you behave under pressure. I grew up selling long before I even had the language for it. From about 9 years old, I worked on my father's antiquarian map stand. The maps were beautiful. They were full of character. They were slightly foxed with age at the edges. And if you lifted one, it had a weight to it. Not just the paper, not just the frame, but the weight of history, captured and made colourful. There was a particular smell of that old paper dust, sometimes a hint of wood from the frames that we housed those maps in. Some people used to come and browse casually, and others leaned in. They would trace the borders, they'd remark on the accuracy or the eccentricities of the maps, and they'd maybe even start to tell us where they'd lived as children. Many of them were really left wide-eyed and astonished by the age of those maps. They would ask really careful questions in a hushed, a reverent tone. And over time, I learned how to read their posture and their stance, what to do when someone hesitated over price, and how to turn their simple curiosity into lasting commitment. And by the time I became an adult, people called me a natural salesperson. And really, based on that experience, I carried an assumption with me for many years that I never even realized that I had. I thought that if you had something of high quality and you understood it deeply enough, then the sale would take care of itself. In simple terms, I thought that clarity was a byproduct of knowledge. In my 30s, for the very first time in my life, I attended a formal sales training. By then I was already a trained actor. I'd trained and I'd specialised in improvisation, classical theatre, and I was comfortable being seen, being uncertain and being wrong in public. At regular stages throughout that sales training, the trainer introduced role play, and you could feel the atmosphere in the room changed almost immediately. People shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Some would fold their arms and some would laugh just a little too nervously. Now, these weren't beginners. These were experienced sales professionals. They were intelligent, they were capable, they were knowledgeable. But there was something about role play that made them recoil. And I think it was because they didn't want to feel exposed. They didn't want to look foolish, and they didn't trust the artificiality of the situation. I had the opposite reaction. I went all in. As soon as we began, something really landed very, very clearly for me. It was almost a physical sensation. I realized that sales conversations could be rehearsed in the same way that performances professionally are rehearsed. Not in a way scripted, not in any way memorized, but prepared for. In the acting world, rehearsal isn't about getting it right. It's about discovering how you behave when something unexpected happens, how you respond to the living moment. And suddenly, I saw sales in exactly the same light. Many people imagine that clarity comes from refining their explanation. But what I saw in that room was something else entirely. Clarity comes from preparing how to show up under pressure. Rehearsal isn't about creating clever lines or producing some polished delivery. It's about noticing things. Things like the first words that we reach for when we're uncertain, when we first meet somebody, how our tone and our body shift when somebody challenges us, which questions we might avoid asking because they're just too difficult, where we might rush, where we might start over-explaining everything instead of simply listening. Without rehearsal, people use explanations that have never been tested in any real-life conversations. And that's really when selling can start to feel strained. Not because our words or even our advice is bad, of course, not because our offer or our product lacks any kind of integrity, but because the expression of those things is basically unfinished. You can feel it, can't you? When someone's pushing out words instead of standing inside them and truly owning what it is that they're saying. You can perhaps feel their body tighten, their voice might constrict, and often their words might multiply and come out in a tumble. When preparation happens in safety, well, something very different occurs in reality. Objections stop feeling like threats, and questions stop feeling like interruptions to a pitch, and our listening improves. Because when we no longer are scrambling to protect a rigid explanation, well, we start to respond from within it. Sales, of course, improve. Yes, that's a given. But more important than the sale itself, the distortion itself reduces. You don't have to bend yourself out of shape just to get through the conversation. I've used this principle ever since I first learned it, sales training in my 30s. First, to build a global sales training business, and later, much later in my 50s, when I moved to Shanghai. And there I spoke not a word of Mandarin. I didn't have a single friend, and I wasn't even fully clear on what I was supposed to be selling. I was starting again in a culture I really didn't understand. But what I did have was the ability to rehearse. To test my expression before I exposed it to anybody else, to notice where my clarity collapsed and then prepare again. The exact same principles apply 2 decades, 5 decades, 100 decades later. My business scaled not through force, not through sheer bravado, but through preparation. The problem was never really a lack of knowledge. Knowledge can be gained. It was carrying that knowledge into the world if it had never been rehearsed. Most communication advice out there stops at what to say, and very little of it, in my experiences, really address how knowing behavior under pressure helps with that expression. That's when my work changed. I stopped helping people to find better explanations, and I started to help them prepare their actual expression so that their expertise could emerge without strain, to be spoken without distortion and presented without pretending to have to be somebody else. Look, if any of this resonates with you, I explore it quietly and calmly in my 7-day clarity sequence. There's one human prompt a day from yours truly, no performance, just examination and a supporting Loom video. You'll find the link in the description. Perhaps it's time for you to rehearse for a week and then notice the difference next time you present in public or under pressure.